three-part series that we've been embarking upon about mental wellness with Kristen. We're so fortunate to have had her the last couple days. A little bit about Kristen, if you're joining us for the first time. Kristen is a mental health therapist with the Family Center. She has 3 years of experience as a community-based mental health therapist and works with diverse populations, including kids, teens, adults, seniors, couples, and families. Kristen takes an eclectic and holistic approach when it comes to counseling, as she views her clients as the expert in their own healing journey. We're so thankful for her graciousness and her absolutely generous spirit that she's allowing to share with us, and we're excited to take part of part 3 today.
Thank you so much, Amber, for that wonderful introduction. And I want to welcome you all, including volunteers, our stage staff, and of course, all of you in our community out there for tuning in for our mental health wellness series in this pandemic. So today I do want to be transparent in if anything triggers you in our presentation today, because we're going to be talking about grief and loss. Please do some self-care. It's okay to take off, yourself out of the picture for a little bit and then come back whenever you can. All right, I want everyone to be comfortable, and I will try my best to have it not be so heavy that it sits in our body so much. All right, so today's presentation is about coping with grief and loss during the pandemic. All right, so I have this picture right here of the ocean. I really like this quote when we talk about grief. And I want to kind of set a basis of how I talk about grief is through the lens of loss. Grief is like the ocean. It comes on waves, ebbing and flowing. Sometimes the water is calm, and sometimes it is overwhelming. All we can do is learn to swim. So how do we define grief? Of course, we like definitions, right? So a dictionary actually defines grief as a deep distress caused by a tangible or intangible loss. So what's a tangible? Something that we can see. So it could be a loss of a home, loss of a house that you had for a long time. Intangible loss of a relationship. You can't really see it, you can't really touch it, but it's an incredible loss that you feel. Grief is the normal and natural reaction to loss or any change of any kind. Grief is the conflicting feelings caused by the end of change in a familiar pattern or behavior. While grieving is a natural process in response to loss, complicated grief or prolonged grief is most prevalent in the older adult population. Complicated grief can lead to poor social life, anxiety, depression, hypertension, cardiac conditions, and overall reduced quality of life, and even worse, suicidality. Okay. Now, I want to also say that each person's grief journey is actually really unique to them. It's as unique as a fingerprint or a snowflake. So not one grief presentation is correct. It's just we all process it differently. So what are the causes or triggers of grief and loss? It could be death of a loved one. So that could be family, friends, humans, but also it can be pets that, have been family to you. Moving, so any moving from another city to a different province, or even country, right? Or moving all the time. Starting school, starting a family or marriage or having children, right? Once you step into different transitions in your life, you kind of lose that, that life that you had before. Divorce or separation, graduation even can also be a cause of grief for some people. End of addictions, major health changes, retirement, financial changes, whether it's having more money or having lost a lot of money, holidays, legal problems, empty nest, or even pandemic, right? So again, these are just some common triggers. When we talk about loss, it's not necessarily like you're losing something. Sometimes it's that when we talk about conflicting feelings, is that gaining something, but also losing something. Okay. Now there's a couple of myths in dealing with losses. So we've often heard people say, oh, don't feel bad. Replace the loss. Oh, your puppy died, just get a different one. You separated with your spouse. Oh, just get another one, right? So replacing the loss. Grieve alone, that we need to grieve alone. Just give it time. We also often heard, you got to be strong for other people, or that we have to keep our lives going and be busy. And then I put in quotations too, a lot of the things that we normally hear from people. Get a hold of yourself. You can't fall apart, especially if you have kids, you got to take care of them. He's in a better place or she's in a better place. The living must go on. Oh, this one's a good one. I hear this a lot too. All things must pass. Oh, God will never give you more than you can handle. Oh, you shouldn't be angry with God. Or, yeah. So now I wanted to ask you guys for our first breakout question number one. Um, can you think of an event during this pandemic, since we're going to be mostly talking about grief and loss in the pandemic, that brought about conflicting feelings like grief, loss, hopefulness, joy? So, as an example, I'm just going to use it myself and as an example. If I'm being transparent, I recently just had a separation during the pandemic of a almost 10-year relationship, and today is actually would have been my 10-year anniversary. But I love doing my job, so this is a great thing for me to do. But yeah, it brought about conflicting feelings because obviously I miss the person and I miss the family that we had. But at the same time, I'm hopeful for the future because I get to do the things I want to do as well, like focus on my career and things like that. So again, something that brought about conflicting feelings can really bring about feelings of grief and loss. So the breakout sessions, by the way, it's voluntary. You don't have to share if you don't want to, but I want to offer the opportunity so that we can talk as a community about certain losses that you've experienced that is unique to you so that we can sort of learn and be there for each other. Again, if something is triggering, I already told the Laurel and the volunteers that you guys can like access my help after our presentation if we have some time. So necessary to have a voice in some of these really hard topics. So I'm just going to continue for the sake of time, but hopefully if we have more time at the end, I will definitely accept questions and things like that. So there is a popular theory about grief called the Kubler-Ross grief cycle. And it's this 5-stage model of grief that has been taught to us. So the first one is denial. That's when you feel those feelings of avoidance, confusion, shock, fear. Well, you're like, this is really not happening to me. Anger is next, right? The frustration, irritation, anxiety. Then there's bargaining, where it's like struggling to find meaning, reaching out to others. That's when you tell your story. And then depression hits, where you feel overwhelmed, helplessness, hostility, and then there's a sense of flight there, like a panic. And then acceptance happens, where you explore options, you have new plans in place. That's when you're able to actually get guidance and direction from people. So, what does that look like in the pandemic? So, how I put it, these are just examples. So, the stages of grief within the pandemic: denial. Oh, the virus won't affect me. Lots of people say, oh, the virus doesn't exist either. The flu kills more people every year. This isn't a big deal. What's anger? Oh, you're making us stay home and take away our freedoms? That's ridiculous. Why didn't anyone get ahead of this? Right? We feel that anger, we're irritable with our family, our friends, or coworkers. Totally went through this too, when we had to when we didn't know what's going on, and we have to like basically flip our whole therapy model from in person to like now deal with it, telephone counseling and video counseling. Bargaining. Okay, if I social distance for 2 weeks, everything will be better, right? This is all temporary and it will save lives, so it'll be worth it. And then we wait and we wait. I remember waiting till like, oh, September, it'll be better. Oh, and now it's like, I don't even know. Depression. When is this all going to end? What's the point? We're all going to get sick anyways. And then we get into those like really like unmotivated to do things. Like sometimes there's days when I'm unmotivated to go to work or to do anything else. Acceptance. This is happening. I have to figure out how to proceed. So that may be when we're planning our self-care, right? How do we protect ourselves from burning out in the pandemic? So that's when acceptance happens. Now, what does it actually feel like? We all think that there's this linear thing, like on the left side, right? The stages of grief is this really nice unilateral or linear motion of like, oh yeah, we go through shock, denial, anger, and then, then we kind of get depressed and then we finally accept. So actually in the reality, our experience is more on the right one, where it's a mumble jumble of feelings. One day you may feel shock and numb and denying it, but then the next day you're probably more hopeful. And then you go back to anger, or you go back to like denial again. Or then you go through, okay, hope, and now you have patterns, you think you've accepted things, but then you can easily go back to anger, especially when something about it triggers you. So it's basically not a linear motion. It's more of this like conflicting feelings, overwhelming. You go back and forth, back and forth. That's what grief is more like. And some key things to remember is that the acceptance is where the power lies when we talk about grief. So, how we want grief to work is this linear thing. Okay, let's go through the stages because I want to get to acceptance. But unfortunately, that's not how grief works. It's really like you go back and forth. Maybe years, you've probably gone to acceptance in 3 or 4 years, but then a holiday might pop up and it gets you back to bargaining, or it gets you back to like anger that this has happened to you. So everyone has also a unique grieving process, right? It's good to keep in mind that people do have their own process. Some people take time, some people take less, and there's no right or wrong with that. We really have to acknowledge that grieving during these times with the pandemic is more difficult than coping with a loss outside of the pandemic. So if you have losses that are happening within what we're doing right now, it's even worse because then it's piling on a loss itself that we feel as a community, as a society, right? So what do we do? This is when we really need to be connected more than ever. And connection doesn't necessarily mean like in person, like connection. We're going to be talking about how to cope, and sometimes it's just the validation of, hey, I hear you that you're going through a tough time, right? That could be made through a phone call, through a text, to whatever it is. And just even coming together right now, like we're doing, listening to each other's experiences, that sort of thing. And we can also alternate between loss and restorative activities, which I will go through in one moment, and develop new rituals or routines. So, what does the loss and restorative activities look like? So, loss oriented would be grief work. So, that may mean like I go to a therapist to talk about my separation. Intrusion of grief, breaking bonds, ties, or relocation. So, moving into a different home, denial or avoidance of restoration changes. Um, like sometimes, okay, I don't want to do anything. So, I'm going to avoid the chores because sometimes we just need to feel some of these emotions that we're feeling. Now, restoration oriented. So that may include attending to life changes, doing new things, distraction from grief, denial or avoidance of grief, new roles, identities, or relationships. So, for example, I took a sick day on Friday and I did some grief work where I just cried for an hour. And then I told myself, I am going to get back to real life after this hour. And that would be the restoration oriented. So, what did I do after I felt my feelings? I picked up my guitar and started writing new songs, right? So something new. And it's okay to go back and forth like this model kind of looks, right? We can go from loss oriented to restoration oriented. And it doesn't have to just be like, I'm going to go through loss oriented for a whole month. It's really up to you how you do that. Now, tools to cope with grief. Resiliency. We are stronger than what we normally give ourselves credit for. For example, that you can also do talk to a grief counselor or any therapist, right? There's therapists that actually um, specialize in grief as well. Support network, attending a grief group. There's apparently bereavement groups in Edmonton. We just have to Google that and research that. Being mindful of the present moment. So tuning into what we're seeing, right? Our senses, just going out in nature, focusing on what you can control. So in the pandemic, if that means what you can control are your thoughts about it, your feelings, and your actions, like doing your routine, focus on that one because you're going to be more successful in controlling that rather than the pandemic going away. Name your emotions. It's okay to say, I am so sick with COVID right now. Like, I am sick of the pandemic. There's days when I feel that way and I'm done talking about it. And there's probably days when I tune into the media and look at the stats, and that's okay. You just have to be with your emotions and name them. Again, we talked about staying connected. Um, there's FaceTime, there's phone calls, there's Zoom. And if you're tired of those outlets, even in person, as long as you're wearing, you have your own physical boundaries, that's really good to have as well. Maintaining a routine or schedule is really important. It's probably something that I've talked to all the clients when we had the lockdown, that has worked for all of them because I asked them about feedback and they said, yeah, routine is actually really good for my mental health. Self-care, what we do to look after our mental and physical well-being. And I remember if you guys were here on the first one when we did it on Monday or on Tuesday, we talked a lot about self-care and how to do a self-care plan. Meditation is also advisable to clear our minds because, again, if we go back to focusing on what we can control, well, it's our thoughts, right? And if we are in control of our thoughts, so does our feelings and our actions. So, meditation is just a way for us to be in the present moment and not think about so much about our past and think about what's to come in the future. Last but not least, positive imagery to think and visualize what brings us peace, especially when we have conflicting feelings. It's really good to think about maybe the positive memories that your loss has given you. So I'm dealing with a lot of clients who lost a lot of people and lately, and the favorite question I ask of them, and they also like to answer is like, what would that person tell you? What are some good memories that you guys have had in the past that you still hold, right? And what do they mean to you? So just elaborating on those positive memories are a really good way to deal with that too. Even when we're talking about the pandemic, it could be the positive memories that you used to have when you had all that freedom, because maybe we take those things for granted sometimes. So it's good to give it a check. Now, when is extra support required? So it could be when people have increased depressive or anxiety symptoms, like a lack of motivation, hopelessness, tearfulness, irritability, increased substance use or unhealthy stirs, which we call short-term energy relieving behaviors that are mostly for distraction, like overeating, binging on alcohol or drugs, sex, shopping, social isolation when you don't really need that, excessive exercise. That one, I really did that after my separation. Workaholism, binging on Netflix or playing video games, etc. Right? You can think it's endless. There's a lot of stirs out there that we do, but in essence what they are is just short-term relieving, right, of what we're feeling. Inability to complete activities of daily living, like getting up, like the very basic of like getting up from your bed, right, doing chores, work, eating, or if you have kids, parenting, can't do that, sleeping. Or also if there's suicidal thoughts, because then what happens is maybe It's not necessarily grief and loss anymore. It could be, depression. It could actually be like another mental health. Also, though, it's good to keep in mind that a lot of people that I see, for example, they all they say is I have depression, when sometimes it's actually the it's grief and loss. They've lost a lot of things, and it's not, depression is just kind of a mask there, right? So there's comorbidity sometimes with all of these things. Now, how do we support others who are grieving? Because all of you today have the power to do that, right? All of you here today, I don't think you would want to learn about grief and loss if you weren't understanding, or you didn't want to know more about how to support maybe people in your life that are going through grief, or yourself as well. So active listening is very important. Like, this is basically saying, okay, letting someone talk about their story, not asking questions, not interrupting them, not saying all those, you know, not going to cheerleader mode, like you're going to be fine, we're going to, those things. Just letting people talk, right? Giving them the space to talk. And nonverbals are also important. So no rolling your eyes, no checking your watches or things like that, right? Just really focusing on the person, having eye contact, that sort of thing, having a mellow voice, right? And if that person is okay to be comforted, asking them, do you need comfort right now, right? Another one is empathic and understanding. So empathy is really, really important here. So a lot of people, when they get messages about loss, even in the pandemic, it could be that they just really don't know what to say. So instead of saying anything that might not be good for the person, why don't we just say, I can only imagine what you were going through? Or basically being honest that, you know what, I actually don't know what that feels like, but I am here to listen or offer you whatever practical support. But I can offer you, helping you call someone, to deal with your grief. I could maybe take you to your appointment, whatever your boundaries are too, right? um, but instead of saying that I do know what you're talking about, if you really don't know, I think it's more helpful to be honest with that person and say, I don't, you're right, I don't know what you're going through, but I'm here to listen to you. Or I understand, this one is my favorite too, just saying like, I understand you may be feeling whatever emotion. It could be like, I understand you may be feeling sad because your your pet just died, because that pet meant a lot to you. Because, or for COVID, I understand you may be feeling angry because you can't do your normal routine anymore, or because um, you don't know how to connect to others, right? Without that in-person stuff. So basically putting yourself in their shoes can help you understand what they're going through. And sometimes that's what people who are grieving needs, is just for you to validate their emotions, not to fix them, but just to see them as like, you know what, this is normal, and I can see you as a person going through this. And then the last one is checking in. So one of the things is, I hear a lot too, is like, okay, call me when you're ready, call me when you want support. But when you are encountering, grief and loss, that's probably the last thing on your mind, is to reach out to people. So I really appreciate that my friends would just say, Kristen, do you mind if I check in on you, twice a week if I don't hear from you, just to say hi, just to see if you're okay. So I appreciated that, because it didn't give me pressure to call them and reach out to them when I'm crying in my couch. Like, it was more, okay, like they would check in on me. So it's kind of nice to have those check-ins as well. So that's very, very useful. Now, each person's grief is as unique as their fingerprint, but what everyone has in common is that no matter how they grieve, they share a need for their grief to be witnessed. That doesn't mean needing someone to try to lessen it or reframe it for them. The need is for someone to be fully present to the magnitude of their loss without trying to point out the silver lining. So I really love this quote. I think it really captures what we've just talked about. That doesn't have to be pointing out the silver lining right away. Could just be sitting with that person, being in silence. I think as a society, we don't do it enough, but there's a beauty to sitting in silence with someone and just witnessing what they're going through or their emotions. And that is more helpful than saying something like, this too shall pass, or those myths, right, that we talked about before. So there's also how to support others who are grieving if they need more professional support. Like Amber said, I work at the Family Center. We are going to have a grief and loss group. Hopefully it'll go by in 2021. It's an in-person support group, or if we get, protocols from the government, it could be virtual as well. But also we offer individual, family, couples, whatever counseling through phone, online, and in person. You just have to Google us and then reach to us. We also have our drop-in hours if you want in person, where you just go to our downtown location and you don't need an appointment, you just walk in. So that when you're feeling grief and loss, I understand that sometimes you feel it right away and you don't necessarily feel it on the other days. So if that's something that interests you, there's a drop-in process for that too. Apparently, there's also a grief and trauma healing center in Edmonton as well. So if you Google that, their address will come up and you can phone them as well. And also there's bereavement groups happening in Edmonton. We just have to search that and see if they even have virtual stuff. All right, and that visibility which makes us most vulnerable is that which also is the source of our greatest strength. So I want to share something that I came across on TED Talk, and it's called How to Transform Grief into Growth. Do we still have enough time, Laurel? Is that okay?
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes.
Okay, perfect. We'll still, hopefully our folks can stay tuned, but here's the presentation. So just listen in.
Felt at peace. And I wanted to figure out why. I wanted to be able to figure out how I can teach other people to feel this level of contentment at peace. So I started writing down the monumental moments of my life where I took a pivot, a turn, a change, and something that was really uncomfortable that helped me grow, something I was proud of. And all of these moments, I was trying to reverse engineer and see, well, what led up to these moments? What caused this? And I was shocked, because every single one of the moments where I was the most proud and grew and stretched all led back to the exact same thing. Grief and immense emotional pain and loss was the catalyst for the biggest growth moments of my life. So I wanted to figure out, well, what did I do? How did I transform this grief into growth? And I realized I used the exact same process for each one of those growing opportunities, those growing moments. It started with forgiveness, and then went into vulnerability, and finished with courage. And this ongoing cycle of forgiveness, vulnerability, and courage has been sprinkled throughout my entire life. Because grief is so much more than losing a person. Grief can be a divorce. Grief can be losing a job. Grief can be any time we lose something that once was that no longer is. I wasn't supposed to wear that earring, I guess. And so with each of those experiences I had, I went through that same cycle. And so I started to dive deeper into, well, what exactly happened? I lost my grandmother to lung cancer. She was diagnosed, and within 2 weeks, she passed. It was so sudden, it was so quick, and I was angry. I was mad. I had so many emotions of, why? The doctor said she had it for 6 months. Why didn't we know? Why wasn't I more involved in her life? All these different questions that always led to the exact same thing, either guilt or blame. And so until I was able to forgive myself, forgive the doctors, forgive the situation, forgive her, forgive all of it, I wasn't able to feel unstuck from that grief and that pain. It was like I was living my life with my back turned to it. And until I forgave, I turned around and became present with what was happening. And when I forgave, I created self-compassion. because I wasn't trying to shoot blame or guilt anywhere in my life. That compassion brought me to the present moment of what was happening. But when guilt and blame were off the table, I was left with the stillness of vulnerability. There was no one left to blame. There was no guilt left to take on. And that vulnerability turned me inside out. It was so uncomfortable. I hated it. Because it was like I was exposed. I didn't want everyone to see my stuff. I wanted to go hide. I wanted to isolate. Each time I've experienced grief, all I want to do is be by myself because I didn't know how to process this pain. And I don't think anyone ever really knows how. We just have to learn to be still with it and become vulnerable, because that vulnerability is going to help transform your grief into growth. That vulnerability of being willing to be still in the moment and let your emotions be in motion. It's so easy to grab a hold of that pain and say, this is who I am. This is my pain. This is my identity. Don't you know what I've gone through? Don't you know the emotional pain I've experienced in my life? You are not your pain. You are so much more than the emotional pain you've experienced in your life. And that's why vulnerability is so key in transforming that grief into growth, because we have to feel it all so we can let it go. And we have to be patient with ourselves for how long that takes. Because vulnerability is going to hit us when we're alone. It's a lot easier to distract ourselves. We got social media, we got Netflix, there's sex, there's drugs, there's anything that takes us out of feeling the vulnerability of our loss and our grief. And so I invite you to not fear it, to embrace it. Because each time I embraced it, even as scary as it was, because I didn't want to do that, I didn't want to feel that. But my fear was that if I don't feel it now, I might feel it later. So I surrendered to that vulnerability. And when I did that, I started to develop self-awareness. I started to know myself better than I ever did before, better than anyone else ever could. That vulnerability started to change me because I had emotional intelligence. I started to know myself. And I always knew that I would be talking about vulnerability in some way. I didn't realize that I'd be grieving while talking about it. I lost someone recently in a tragic accident, and I didn't know how much vulnerability it would take to talk about this while still grieving. And so my process of vulnerability today is by being here. Vulnerability as well for me is crying. I let it out. I welcome it. Vulnerability is sometimes dancing. Vulnerability is any form of expression that allows me to learn a little bit about myself, to not latch onto it, to not shun it, but to be an observer of it and letting it come and letting it go. And when I did that, I started to develop courage. Because if I can go through that emotional pain and let myself feel all of those feels, then what else can I do? Because that seemed like the scariest thing in my life. Losing the people that I love to the unknown. But that courage helped transform that grief into growth. Because of courage, I was able to travel the world. Because of courage, and because of the grief I got from that courage, some days it was just getting out of bed. It was something as simple as that. The courage depended on what I was experiencing. It didn't have to be some big monumental thing. But each of the big growing moments in my life always led back to grief and pain. And that emotion, being willing to go through the cycles of forgiveness, vulnerability, and courage. Grief is going to be inevitable. We are all going to experience it in one way or another, whether you already have, or whether you're currently experiencing it, or something in the future. You're going to experience it. But it doesn't have to define you, but you can use it as fuel to grow. And you can use those experiences to transform your life. If there's any takeaways that you have from this talk by listening of how to transform grief into growth, I hope it's that you don't have to stay stuck in your grief. And you can find relief in your emotions and in those griefs. And you can have happiness available to you in the midst of what you are experiencing. Thank
All
you.
right. That always gets me, even in light of the pandemic. I really love that because I know what you guys are feeling with the pandemic. It can be really, really harsh and it could be really bad. But again, it's just being able to do virtual workshops I never thought I would be doing as a therapist. Now I get to do them. And now we can come together as a community and do other things post COVID even. So there's always something that can grow from a very, very uncomfortable situation like grief and loss. So I really want to thank you all. I know we have like a couple minutes. I do have another breakout session, but I understand if you do have to leave because our presentation is only till 2:45, that I want to thank you for your time. But if people are staying, however, we can still do the breakout question, which is pretty positive. I will end it in a very positive note, I promise. What is a takeaway or lesson you have learned from going through a certain kind of loss in your life? And if you want to be specific, because we're talking about the pandemic, what is a takeaway or lesson you've learned or you're learning right now while you're going through this pandemic?
Great. Thank you, Kristen. And thank you so much for this amazing session, not only for today, but for the last 2 days.